I remember watching Unbreakable as a kid with my dad and immediately connecting it because of the father-son relationship, even if it was a bit complex for me to understand. So then to have that I actually saw the trailer for Glass before I ever watched Split, so I filled in the background, and so I was exhilarated seeing it on day one. So I really enjoyed it. But anyway, so Unbreakable, after the title card, exalting comics and setting up your expectations that this is going to be somehow connected to a superhero universe. The first scene is actually Elijah, which is an interesting bookending device because you see his birth in the back room of a JCPenney department store in 1961, which means he's about, 38, 39 when the original film happens.
I think the age of Elijah and his mother get a little bit confused by the time you get to Glass.
It's mainly because the actress playing Elijah's mother is 5 years younger than Samuel L. Jackson, even though she's meant to be about 20 years older at least.
It's obvious that they've only done that so that her age would be appropriate in the flashbacks.
Yeah, exactly. And she's a good actress, don't get me wrong.
She's a good actor.
So it's an interesting bookending device because, I mean, spoiler alert, again, the final scene of is the grand reveal that it's also been an origin story for Mr. Glass, the supervillain. It's been a journey of self-discovery, not just wholesomely for David, but for Elijah, who wants to really affirm to himself that he wasn't a mistake, and he'll at least fill the villain role, which feels very meaningful for him, rather than just be nihilistic and
It
lost.
vindicates his existence and what the quest that he had been on, and it's a theme that runs throughout all three of these films, which is broken and damaged people trying to find some reason for them living.
Yeah, and we're introduced to how broken he is because as soon as he comes out of the womb,
he's literally every bone in his body is broken or something.
Yeah,
like
the doctor who's attending on scene says to the department store staff, "Did you drop the baby?" And they say no. So that's meant to be nebulous.
It's very effectively done because you never see his body all broken and mangled or anything. It leaves it to your imagination. And I think that's something that's really effective about, to be fair, all three of these films, which is the actual viewpoint that Shyamalan takes through the filmmaking is kind of that of an incidental onlooker. There's a lot of what feel like POV shots just from the distance through cracks in doors. Most effectively is after the initial train crash, where you see David in the hospital and he's sat there and there's just one long unbroken take and you're seeing it from the perspective of the camera, which is kind of resting on the table of a man who's being operated on, who's about to die, who is the only other person who came out of that train initially alive. And it feels almost wrong to be looking at it from that viewpoint because you do feel like you're intruding in on two people's very personal moments.
It's framed in a very good way as well, not just that scene, but also when he becomes the overseer with the poncho, and in Elijah's birth scene where you see a transition from the doorway to then only seeing Elijah and the doctor in the mirror framed. And the obvious intention there is to see not only everything through glass or reflections, talking about Mr. Glass, but it's to create the illusion of comic book paneling. And that's a really clever seeding that he does throughout a lot of the scenes.
Yes, I think it also does help to the grounded nature of it, because we as normal people would see these superheroes in this universe as the unassuming people that we are. So it gives that sense of you're just the onlooker looking at something that you don't really understand, you can only ever view glimpses of, which ends up tying into some of the themes that I saw from Glass, that of the exceptional being pushed down and not recognised by the rest of society for what it is. And in fact, by the time we get to Glass, actively kept down by shady forces.
Yeah, and that also links to my interpretation that this has been seeded throughout with specifically Christian theology, because that secret society, which ends up keeping them down, has some interesting biblical allusions tied up with the clover tattoo. But
well, I only recognised the three-leaf clover. Obviously, not the lucky clover.
The origins of the three-leaf clover have interesting implications.
Oh, right, okay, that'll be interesting to get to.
So then it cuts to Bruce Willis's introduction, which I think is just an excellent scene, because it starts off with him being quite depressed, leant up against the window, pending returning home to Audrey and Joseph, and he sees the sort of smiling eyes of the kid between the seats, and that establishes his capacity to be compassionate and fatherly. When the young woman with the weird tramp stamp tattoo, who's very dressed in the 2000 style, sits down and he takes off his wedding ring, he strikes up a conversation with her, and he's almost instigating anything possible to endear himself to her. When she clocks on with her female intuition that he's obviously only trying to talk to her to get in her pants, he does the most beta male thing of pretending, oh, no, you've misunderstood, and has this soft gaslighting. And then it cuts to the kid no longer being on her head and being playful, just staring at him with judgment there. It's really effective because
she stares daggers through him. It's brilliant.
It wordlessly communicates his own internal guilt over failing as a father and a loyal husband because he can't make his relationship work and he feels arbitrarily distanced from his own son back home. And so it sets up his character conflict brilliantly.
In just one scene, it establishes every theme that's going to be running throughout David's journey, which every single aspect of that does end up getting tied up very nicely by the end of the film. And I do also just like the fact that David has no game.
Yeah.
No, you can tell that this is probably the first time he's tried to do anything like this, because it seems to me that later on in the film it's established that they'd already grown estranged by this point.
Yes.
And this seems to be like a last-ditch effort of David, probably to try and give himself a little bit of joie de vivre in his life, because his life is so desperately and hopelessly unremarkable.
Well, it's also, it seems like he's reaching out and seeing if he can test himself and seeing if he's still capable. Because let's not forget, David and Audrey met while they were in college when he was at the peak of his football career. He retired his football career out of fear that he'd either injure someone else or that someone would find out about his invulnerability. And so they've been together in a rut where he's been repressing the fact that he feels internally inadequate, and that internal inadequacy has led him to distance himself from fulfilling the roles of husband and father. And it's created domestic discord, and he's felt miserable about that.
And ironically, that inadequacy, that deep inadequacy that he feels, comes from the fact that in reality, he is exceptional. He is one of the most exceptional people in the world, and he is denying himself full recognition and full acknowledgement of that exceptionalism.
Yeah, he's doused the burning flame of the call to heroism, and in absconding that, he feels miserable and slightly resentful, but the resentment isn't necessarily at his wife and child. It's at knowing he is voluntarily falling short, but feeling incapable of expressing himself and becoming the hero that his son sees him as.
Yes.
He knows he thinks he can never live up to that expectation, because if he lives up to that expectation, then he'll be exposed in some way as something that he doesn't fully understand. It's only in embracing that exceptional ability and living up to the responsibilities that are laden within his relationships that he becomes heroic. So I know we're skipping ahead to the conclusion a little bit by accident, but that is why this film is so effective, because it has a really wholesome message specifically for husbands and fathers at the heart of it.
Yeah, I think as a man, I don't know, obviously I can't take a female perspective watching this, but as a man, it really does connect with me, that feeling of almost self-imposed inadequacy, the feeling of, I know I can do better, I know I can strive for more, I know that I have much greater potential than I'm letting myself have access to right now. And that weighs down on yourself. It weighs down when you recognize that your own failures are at your own hands. David's failures, as he perceives them, are due to the fact that he doesn't strive, he's holding himself back very purposefully, he doesn't want to acknowledge how great he could be. And that really hits me.
Yeah, no, I can sort of give a small analogy of this, of when you want something to really go right so much and it contorts you into being a bit snappy, you become unpleasant company for the person that you really want it to go right for. So I know I have a personal failing of, as a bit of a perfectionist and someone who's quite protective, whenever I travel somewhere or go on a holiday or go on a short break, I want everything to go just right. And so I get stressed when we're in transit if there are delays, if I want to make sure the person I'm with is looked after enough that they don't have to stress about the journey. I'm handling everything. And if something goes slightly wrong beyond my control, I feel an immense sense of guilt that they're not having the best time they could have. And they can tell it's making me detached because I'm not being very present, because I'm constantly thinking and worrying about the future. And so that creates an artificial rift between you and someone else when it's just a sense of guilt over not being able to provide from them enough. And that seems to be what David's done. His internal conflict is that he feels incapable of living up to his full potential. He knows that full potential will serve his wife and his son. And in not doing that, he's become withdrawn. And so he's creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of the demise of his own relationship because he's not taking that call to heroism.
Yeah, it's a brilliant examination of male inadequacy, but male self-imposed inadequacy.
Yeah.
Like I say, his feelings and what he's actually disappointed with himself about are very masculine virtues.
Mm.
The idea of setting the example for your son to be a strong role model for him.
Exactly. I remember, so Quentin Tarantino said this is one of his favorite films.
I saw that interview as well, yeah.
And he described it as, it's genius because what if you did Superman who didn't know he was Superman until he hit a midlife crisis? And the Superman connection, particularly as sort of paragon of masculinity, is intentional from Shyamalan because he didn't just do the alliterative names like David Dunn or Reed Richards or Bruce Banner, but David Dunn, his name is actually based on the original short story that Siegel and Schuster wrote, the creators of Superman, under a pseudonym, Herbert S. Fine, which was called The Reign of the Superman in 1933.
Oh, really? I wasn't aware of
Yeah,
that.
and it's based on the Nietzschean idea of the Superman, where Superman's a villain rather than an actual hero. And what ends up happening is there's a scientist called Professor Smalley who takes a guy queuing up in a 1930s bread line in America, who's a homeless man, and he drugs him, granting him temporary telepathy. And so then Bill Dunn kills Professor Smalley, goes to a national conference of world leaders trying to enact world peace, and tries to use his telepathy to sow chaos and take over the world, and then immediately burns out and falls flat and goes back into the breadline. So Siegel and Schuster were saying that if human beings were ever granted this incredible power, particularly the intellectual power, they would be corrupted enough to try and perfect the world to where they would then pervert it, and they'd become the inevitable villain. The Übermensch would become the nihilistic destroyer.
That feels more, in terms of the intellect, much more close to Mr. Glass.
Exactly, it is. And that's definitely what M. Night Shyamalan is drawing upon, because obviously Elijah's story is going from, okay, I have a nihilistic lack of purpose, I'm going to engineer everything to give myself a nemesis who is the paragon of goodness, the opposite to me, just so I know my place in the world. And he thinks that the villainy is necessary in order to raise the critical consciousness of people with abilities so they can be their true selves. So what obviously ends up happening is, and in a very well shot way, that I'm glad they didn't go with what they originally wanted to do, which was a roll cage and seeing people screaming and flying out the windows. The train accident is done very subtly.
M. Night said that his original idea was a plane, whereas it became a train because he thought that it would help to ground it within reality. It would help raise some uncertainty, maintain some uncertainty, because one guy surviving a train crash sounds more plausible than one guy surviving a plane crash that
they
killed
actually
everybody
did work
else.
the plane crash in, of course, as one of the things that Elijah does to try and find someone exceptional.
However, obviously nobody survives that particular plane
nor the
crash.
hotel fire or the mudslide
Also,
in Mexico.
I think it probably would have saved them a lot of money, because there is an endearingly low-budget feel to all three of these films, which is in stark and brilliant contrast to the overproduced, over-budgeted nonsense that is released by Marvel these days. It is a nice palate cleanser to watch a superhero origin story and then trilogy taken seriously on a low budget that still manages to do everything that it sets out to do.
Absolutely. So the funny thing is, the set pieces that Shyamalan featured in the film, mainly the original train accident that had people screaming that was then slashed, and then the fairground scene that was actually shot for Unbreakable and was only then featured in Glass. They were the most expensive and longest shooting.
Well, you mean the fairground scene where Glass breaks himself sliding around? I mean, that makes sense because I knew that he'd used deleted scenes from Unbreakable in Glass. But even then, those set pieces are tiny. They wouldn't make the cut of a Marvel film. No. Oh, kid whose bones break easily sits on a fairground ride and ends up slamming into the sides and breaking his bones.
We can't develop our villains in our film. It'll take away from the times of joking and CGI punching.
Exactly.
So obviously after that, it then cuts to the Philadelphia street where David's son is in the house watching the train derailment on the news. There was a scene cut there where Audrey as well, who was renamed from Megan in the script for some reason. And Audrey is not a biblical name. It's an old Anglo-Saxon name with Christian roots, so I don't know why that decision was made, but she was also seeing it on the news, but thankfully we don't see that because I think it's nice as well. There are a few deleted scenes featuring David and Audrey in this. Her reaction to the train derailment, her calling him to go to dinner and pretending that they're still in university as some sort of flirting.
Yeah, hello.
Is David Dunn there?
Audrey?
Yes. Is this David?
Yeah. Audrey, where are you calling from?
My name is Audrey Inverso. We went to college together.
I remember you.
I was hoping you'd call me, but anyway, I decided not to wait. I was thinking it might be nice to go to dinner together.
That feels very Sixth Sense.
It's sweet, but I prefer the pacing where it
This
wasn't.
sounds unnecessary because it sounds as though it would have added to the relationship in a way that doesn't emphasize the coldness and distance.
It would have made David more passive, if anything, and I don't quite like that. And there was also another scene which David and Audrey went on an initial date before the date that we see them go on in the film, where they're talking about colours and songs. And they have a moment where they're saying, oh, we're acting unlike ourselves because you're using a napkin and you're not wiping your mouth on your sleeve like you do at home. And then one of Audrey's friends from the school comes over and says, oh, I'm so glad you're back dating again. What type of lawyer are you? And then she goes, this is my husband. So the implication is that Audrey has been talking to people outside the marriage just like David had done. I prefer the implication that Audrey hadn't, actually.
Yeah, I feel like that lends a lot of unnecessary background noise to their relationship that doesn't need to be there to tell the story that it does.
I think it wanes from David's personal arc of struggling, not necessarily with fidelity, but with commitment because he's withdrawn, and instead puts them both as they're so estranged from the marriage, they're looking for other people. I prefer the idea that Audrey is in exile from the love that she's very much committed to, and it takes David's self-realization to allow him to embrace it again.
It ties into this idea that David has very obviously, by this point in his life, realized that he's in a dead-end job for what he feels at that time at the beginning of the film might be in a dead-end marriage, has basically, through denying his own potential, through lying to himself, through giving up his football career in the way that he does and then lying to those around him at the same time, he's just let his own life pass him by. In a similar way to Walter White at the beginning of Breaking Bad, a man with great untapped potential who, for the sake of comfort and security, decided to abandon all of it, whereas relying so much on that comfort and security has led him to an incredibly unfulfilled life, unfulfilled dreams, unfulfilling relationships with those around him. And it's only later on by embracing that potential, that very masculine potential, that he is able to turn everything around. But at the time, at the beginning, he's looking for a kind of a new beginning. Maybe he's thinking, I can cut and run a little bit. Maybe I can do something to get myself out of this situation whilst still denying who I really am, which just does not work.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.